Peace be with you. Dear friends, welcome to Living Flame Sunday Gospel Reflections. We are celebrating third Sunday of Lent. Gospel according to John, chapter 2, verses 13 to 25. Now the Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. John constantly tells us that Jesus went to Jerusalem for the different feasts of the Jews, and especially for the Passover. This is apparently Jesus' first Passover after taking up his calling. It is not too surprising that it is not mentioned in the other Gospels, for the other Gospels tell us little about his early ministry in Jerusalem, especially in its earlier stages, concentrating rather on his itinerant ministry. Thus, they tended to disregard the happenings at the trips to Jerusalem, possibly because they were not present. In John's Gospel, his disciples are very clearly aware the meaning of the 12. Because they saw Galilee rather than Judea as the true reflection of Jesus' ministry, the disciples were not very much embarrassed going to Jerusalem, because Jesus' whole ministry was directed to going to Jerusalem. Galilee welcomed him, Judea put him to death. But John, who records a number of trips to Jerusalem, perhaps did not wish to jar the account of the final visit by describing a violent visit to the temple, and perhaps wished to finish his gospel on a spiritual note with his concentration on the cross. He does, after all, leave out the physical details of the Last Supper and of Jesus' prayers in Gethsemane, and he ignores Jesus' actual baptism and the transfiguration while hinting at both. His later concentration is on the new coming of the Spirit, and he might well have seen the reception of such an event as superfluous to what he wanted to say, or even as taking attention away from what he saw as important. But he does remember this early incident and describes it because it fits in well with his purpose to indicate that the new has come. He is well aware that the latter cleansing is already well known in the Christian church, while an action like this helps to explain why in the other Gospels the leaders are so antagonist to Jesus at an early stage, as we see in Mark chapter 3 verse 22. And this one provides an opportunity for him to hint at the coming death and resurrection of Jesus, where he says, "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days." And we know he found in the temple those who sold oxen and sheep and doves, and the money changers doing business. Entering the temple, he was actually angry. He found in the court of the Gentiles, set apart for Gentile worship, men who were selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and others who were at tables exchanging currencies. This money exchanging was necessary because the temple tax, which was required of every Jew, had to be paid in Tyrian coinage, which had no idolatrous images on it, and many had come from afar bringing tainted money, and they had to exchange it in the temple so that the tainted money would not be offered in any way to God or offered to God in sacrifices. Therefore, the money changers were in some way very much connected in cleansing the currencies. Jesus was not attacking the service provided, but the whereabouts of its taking place, which was basically an insult to the Gentiles who worshipped there. Prior to Passover, Jesus was very much looking forward to going to Jerusalem. And before the Passover, Jews were expected to ensure that they were ritually clean. Great efforts were made to prevent the possibility of uncleanness. Graves would be painted white in order to ensure that Jews did not come into contact with death just prior to the Passover. For if they were unclean, Jews could not participate in the Passover. So there was a great emphasis on ritual purity. Thus, Jesus may well have had this in mind when he saw what he considered to be degrading the temple premises, especially when he saw tainted money being brought into the temple containing its idolatrous images, and the noise of cattle disturbing the peace, while their droppings also polluted the temple. The hypocrisy of it seemingly came home to him. Conscious of his new ministry, he was thus angered at this use of his Father's house, which he saw as a place of prayer and worship even for the Gentiles. Well, in verse 15 we read, "When he had made a whip of cords, he drew them all out of the temple with the sheep and oxen, and poured out the changers' money, and overturned the tables." In verse 16 we read, "And he said to those who sold doves, 'Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of merchandise.'" Please take note that his emphasis here is on removing the offering animals from the temple area. His whole emphasis is that of turning the court into a place of prayer. So he makes a small scourge. No weapon or stick was allowed in the temple during that time, and drives out the animals, tips over the tables of money changers, and then says to those who were selling doves, they were selling doves for sacrificial purposes, "Get these out of here. Do not make my Father's house a marketplace." And also notice here that even in his prophetic anger, his compassion and self-control are shown, for he does not act in a way that will harm the doves. He does not attack the men. His intent is to empty the temple of the commotion resulting from the trading. The whole picture is one of spontaneous action as a result of the impact that the scene has made on him. Quite unlike his studied purpose in Mark, where he first goes in and surveys the temple. Please refer to Mark 11, verse 11, and then later carries out his planned action, concentrating solely on those involved and ignoring the cattle and sheep, and being concerned especially about the dishonest practices taking place. Theoretically, the activities of the traders might have been seen as justified as they made it convenient for worshippers, but to Jesus it meant that concentration was diverted from the main purpose of the temple, that of meeting God, and it showed disregard for the Gentiles who came to worship, and indeed for the temple itself. It raises for us a question that we should ask ourselves. Do some of our church activities come under the same heading? Well, in verse 17, his disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house has eaten me up." The words cited here by John come from Psalm 69, verse 9. And there it is also in a context where insults are being offered to God, just as they were here. We are not told when the disciples remembered the words. Probably it was at the time, but it confirms to them and the readers that here is one who fulfills the scriptures and takes worship seriously, and is willing to be unpopular in order to purify it. Well, in the following verse 18, the Jews answered and said to him, "What sign do you show us since you do these things?" Well, Jesus' answer was very clear, that he came to do the will of the Father, and therefore he will destroy it and rebuild it in 3 days, the temple of his body. So he will die and he will resurrect and he will purify the entire temple of humanity. After all, like others, they eagerly waited a unique figure who would aid their cause, for they too were sure that one day God would act as he had promised through such a unique figure, and the incident has done little harm. Dear friends, today as we remember to celebrate this particular event in the life of Jesus, cleansing of the temple, when he answered that he would destroy this temple and in 3 days he will raise it up, Jesus' reply is straight and simple. And it is a very clear indication Jesus came to establish a new covenant. He would establish a new temple. He would establish a new type of worship where people will worship in spirit and in truth, as he had told to the Samaritan woman. Let us understand this gospel passage in its proper context during this Lenten season. Dear friends, we are all called to cleanse ourselves, as St. Paul calls that we are the living temples of the Holy Spirit. Let us then ask the Lord to bless us with this grace, that during this Lenten season we may continue to purify ourselves, our bodies, our minds, our hearts, our souls, and prepare a place for Jesus to come in, as he would appear after the resurrection with this new covenant, and he will address us, "Peace be with you." The peace of Jesus will enter into our hearts, and our temples will be temples of real, authentic worship to God, and especially the temples of our heart. God bless you.